It's always great each year to talk to some of my fellow film critics about the year in film and their favourite or best films. And it's my great pleasure now to be talking to Peter Malone, who is a fellow film critic and part of the Catholic Film Office. Peter, welcome to Movie Metropolis, as always.
Peter, thank you very much. We seem to have been doing this for a long, long time.
We have a number of years, but always interesting to hear what you thought were the best films. So let's talk about that. So, Peter, what were your favorite or best films of 2024?
I was surprised when I was going through the list of the reviews each month, and the ones that stood out were actually those in foreign languages. I was surprised how I wasn't actually noting down many American films at all, let alone British. And even, I suppose I could say, a bit of a disappointing year for Australian films. Would that be right?
To a general extent, yes, there are a couple of good Australian films this year, but fair enough.
So I'll just go through if that's all right, and you might like to make a comment whether you like these films or not.
Sure.
Actually, early in the year, I suppose there was The Zone of Interest and Anatomy of a Fall. One couldn't leave them out, and they were Oscar winners as well. I actually was very much taken by them both, and The Zone of Interest really to go to Auschwitz, be just outside the wall and look at the life of the commandant and his family, and knowing what was going on inside without their virtually showing us anything, except later the cleaners, for instance, but the smoke going up. And I was impressed too because the director is actually British, isn't he?
Yes.
Jonathan Glazer. So, but it was made in German. So
Yeah.
I was very taken with that, and
Yes.
also Anatomy of a Fall.
Yes. Zone of Interest was my best film of the year as well. And I don't know if you saw the documentary, The Commandant's Shadow, which was at the Jewish International Film Festival, but that was a really interesting doco about the grandson visiting the house and concentration camp and his reflections on his father and what he actually did. Fascinating doco, if you can catch it.
Yes, I must try and track that down then, because again, this wasn't one of the films of the year, but it was in the German Film Festival, the film about Goebbels, for instance, and taking us behind the scenes with Goebbels. And the strange thing with that film, not quite a normal Hitler, but a more normal looking and sounding Hitler than we're used to seeing with the all the films and the footage and the newsreels. So to that extent, I always am fascinated by that kind of film. And even though it isn't on my list, but I enjoyed it very much,
Hmm.
the episode in Lee, where she actually then sits in Hitler's bath and photographs Dachau. So I suppose on that level, there have been some very interesting World War II films, at
Ab-
least this year.
Absolutely agree with you. I think the film you were talking about just before, was that Führer and Seducer,
It
about
is
Goebbels? That was at the Jewish Film Festival, yes.
Jewish Film Festival. That's
Yep,
right, yes. Well worth seeing and
yes,
quite alarming in its way.
it is.
Well, now I was asked by our editor of Australian Catholics to nominate two films that stood out, and I was very interested that I chose two, and my fellow reviewer chose another two, with which I agreed very much. But the four films were again foreign language. So I'll comment on the two that I chose.
Yep.
I was very taken with Io Capitano,
Ah,
and I'd seen the Camorra films by the director, and so I was very surprised that here he was making, although the gangsters did come in on that trek from Senegal to Italy, even there on the African continent, so he's familiar with gangsters, but just knowing that there are so many asylum seekers and refugees from Africa and wanting a story that spent a lot of time with them. And so we start in Senegal, two enthusiastic teenagers thinking that life will be wonderful in Europe. What they went through to get the passports, the money, separation for the family, and then not to go on too much about it, but I was very taken with the trek and the various difficulties, and then the exploiters along the way, and still wondering why it was called Io Capitano, till finally the people smugglers with the boats, to avoid some kind of detection, making the youngsters the captains of the boats to get them across the Mediterranean. Uh, I found it a very humane film.
Mm.
So that was one of my choices.
Yes.
And the other one, I was surprised as I went through the list. I hadn't been thinking about it, but I remember at the time very taken with Perfect Days. So I suppose Wim Wenders has been a very interesting director for the last almost 50 years, I suppose.
Mm.
And I remember our Catholic group giving him a prize way back in Venice. No, it was at Locarno. And one of my treasures is in a group photo with him. So there's been always an interest in his films. And I was surprised. There we were in Japan, and a very sympathetic and unusual character, and spending the week with him. And again, just the humanity of the whole story. So a contrast there, uh, a European in Japan and a European in Africa being the two films that really stood out for me.
Okay. Fair enough. I must say, Perfect Days was a fascinating also insight into some of the toilets in Tokyo and so on.
Well, I didn't want to mention that, but yes, I suppose it was one of the main themes, really.
Yes.
The cleanliness and the work and the conscientiousness and all the rest of it, and Japanese customs and politeness as well.
Yeah.
Yes. My colleague had another one that probably was my number three that I might have put. And again, I was surprised. It's a more recent one in release, probably still around at the moment. My Favorite Cake.
Yes.
I I really did enjoy that. Um, One of the things you mentioned, Catholic Office and international Catholic film organisations. Um, in 2002, we were invited to Iran because the Iranian film industry had had a visit to the Vatican in 1999. And so there was this kind of dialogue going on and a conversation. So the Fajr Festival invited the Catholic Church to be there at Fajr. And since I was leading the thing at the time, suddenly, I thought it was a joke at first, they said, get your visa for Iran. And it was the month of the Axis of Evil of George W. Bush. But I was able to go there many times, and the welcome there, irrespective of the ideology of the leadership and the way that it's exercised, I must say it was very welcoming. So I note that a vast number of Catholic and ecumenical over the decades have gone to Iranian films. They somehow stand out, and you start making a list of the directors and think of Jafar Panahi there in prison. Uh, Even these people that made My Favorite Cake were not allowed to go to Berlin.
Yeah.
So that kind of repression. But I really felt I was back there. And this story of the elderly lady, widow for such a long time, and then buying the provisions and making the breakfast or whatever, luncheon for her lady friends.
Mm.
And then suddenly this relationship with the taxi driver, I wouldn't have thought he was an actor. He seemed to me so real,
Yeah.
almost documentary-like. But I looked him up and he's a Iranian actor. And I thought it was wonderful in itself in terms of friendship and breaking through the narrow repressions of Iranian religious law, so to speak. but I thought it was really international and humane. So you see, I'm starting to use the word humane films that I've nominated.
Yes.
So I've got a list here that I'm glancing at,
Yep.
and I'm going to go to a documentary which I was very taken with called No Other Land.
Ah.
So we were there in pre-Gaza invasion, except that the postscript was made to the film after October the 7th, 2023.
Mm.
But here's a Palestinian friendly with an Israeli filmmaker, and they're really looking at the situation between Gaza, the occupation, the presence of the Israelis, the behavior of the Israelis. And so, given the times we're living in and the particular challenge, sorry about that. Speaking of the Japanese toilets, that's the Australian rubbish collectors passing by. Anybody who's wondering what such noise outside my window, but that's it. So I found it provocative. I found it, in a way, very even-handed. I noticed that it's up for a number of nominations for documentary awards in 2024. So I thought it's important these days to have a film like No Other Land.
Yes.
Speaking of land, I've got here Promised Land with
Ah.
Mads Mikkelsen. I suppose any Danish film with Mads Mikkelsen is important, and he seems to loom a lot. I didn't realise till I read the credits at the end of Mufasa that there he was as that villainous white king's voice,
Yep.
menacing throughout the film. Uh, but in this one, I thought he was interesting in terms of a single-mindedness in his land, in his propriety, in his ambitions. And I've forgotten the name of the actor at the moment, but I saw him in another Danish film more recently, was almost the embodiment of callous evil in his oppression then of those who were in the land. He was the landowner. So in terms of a historic, dramatic confrontation and hopes and ambitions of the 19th century, uh, I thought I'd add that to my list. So
Yep.
again, I enjoyed that.
Yes.
I think I'm getting near the end. There's 11. Let me see. Oh, yes, I'd better mention Green Borders. Again, now here's a bit of name dropping, and I always enjoy that with you.
Yes.
But in Iran, one year, uh, who should be one of the visitors to the festival? Agnieszka Holland.
Ah.
And so instead of asking for autographs, I brought out the camera and said, would you mind a photo? So I do have a nice photo, and she's appropriately veiled because she's there in Tehran. But looking at her films over the decades, quite an extraordinary range when you think she came from communist Poland and that kind of atmosphere, and the films that she made then, and then the move to America and to England, and films like The Secret Garden
Mm.
and some of the television programs that she's made, and yet returning to these darker themes. And again, the reality finishing with the 22nd of February 2022 and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But here it is, and again, like Io Capitano, but the refugees coming from the east this time, and the trick of the president of Belarus wanting refugees there so that he could exploit them against the European Union. So I found it very topical. And once again, I'll enjoy saying this, having been to Belarus twice, and in the job that I had with the International Catholic Film Officers, the international title was president. And we arrive in Minsk and we're told, you can't use that word. There's only one president in Belarus, and he's been there for decades and he's still there.
Mm.
And they also suggested in our group of 40 at the meeting, there were probably half a dozen spies there reporting on us. That was 2003, so 20 years ago. But
Yep.
so I really was very taken with these hopeful Syrian refugees arriving in Belarus, then tossed over the barbed wire into Poland, and then the Polish guard tossing them back into
Mm.
Belarus, and they're starving. And then, of course, the story of those social workers and their great concern for the refugees and the dangers there, and then some from Africa as well. So it's a very long film, very depressing, I
Yep.
thought, and probably well worth seeing in the depressing atmosphere of today's world.
Yes.
So when you No Other Land and Green Border, it's really saying something about the world we live in.
Yes.
Right. I've got two more.
Yep.
They're very similar in plot, but one is from Spain in the 1930s, and the other is from Mexico around 2010-11.
Ah.
So I'd like to mention The Teacher Who Promised the Sea, and then the Mexican film Radical.
Ah.
And I found them both very interesting in terms of creativity in education, as well as, of course, the social background in which they occur. So Radical is probably much more up to date. Uh, Corruption in Mexican government, grants to schools, a disillusioned teacher, his way of involving the students to be creative, their own interests, and get them going from there. So I really did enjoy Radical. And then I saw The Teacher Who Promised the Sea.
Yep.
Well, of course, there's so much more. The same education theme, but in the context of the Spanish Civil War, in a way, quite harrowing. So, did you notice that similarity between those two films?
I did, in terms of
Very,
education and children and creativity, and against a backdrop of difficult circumstances. Yes.
yes, I thought you might because of your education background that they
Yep.
would be of interest. Yes. And they both came out at much the same time, which I
Yes.
found interesting. But The Teacher actually has been very successful. I notice I live near the Baldwin Palace cinemas,
Yep.
and it lingered and lingered and lingered. So obviously it was very popular with people.
Mm.
Uh, and in a way, some of the aspects of the Civil War and executions I found extremely harrowing.
Yes.
I wasn't expecting such directness, given the humanity of the teacher and his working with the children.
Yep.
So I think that's the end of my international. So I suppose, how are we going for time? Can I
We're
mention
okay.
some of the...
Yep. Keep going.
Well, before I say anything, and before you might shut me off in disgust, I'm going to put in a good word for a film that I really admired and enjoyed,
Yeah.
Joker: Folie à Deux.
Okay.
Well, that's a non...
I, I,
That's...
I'm not quite as effusive about it. I was disappointed, but that's okay. You tell me more about what attracted you to the film.
I was caught up in it. I thought, you've had the spectacle of the first Joker, and everybody went to see it, and Joaquin Phoenix got his Oscar, all those kinds of things. And I felt, oh, I've entered into something rather different, and I will allow myself to be surprised and be led. Whereas in a lot of the commentaries, everybody just refused to budge. It's not bringing the same zest that they experienced in the first Joker, so therefore wipe it. And I was very disappointed
Yeah.
in a lot of the reviews that I read. But I found it fascinating in its low key, the whole prison experience, the court case, the ambiguity of Arthur as Joker and as Mad, and then the folly, the madness are the two, not just between himself and Harley Quinn, and that was certainly there, but I thought the madness between the two Arthurs.
Hmm.
So his outer Arthur and his inner Arthur. So having been caught on that from the very prison sequences, then the songs and, the ones we know well that he should be singing, if my friends could see me now, and what the world needs now is love, street, love, sweet love. And what that was doing in terms of enjoyable incongruity, and then the whole behaviour in the court case, and the lawyers and the behaviour, and then, not to spoil the ending, but not an ending that I would have foreseen. So I finished up thinking, I've really found this film quite fascinating.
Okay.
So that's a bit of a plea for Todd Phillips when everybody else, although on IMDb recently I saw it's doing very well on streaming, so that maybe he will have a cult classic and it will be popular because of streaming. And I suppose a lot of people who said, well, I won't spend the money on this one, not in the cinemas, but I'm curious enough to see what it's like. I'll watch it in streaming.
Okay.
So that's a bit of my little plea for Joker Folie à Deux.
Fair enough.
Um, I've got one other documentary.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed a lot of the documentaries this year, but one, I suppose it's because the age I am and what was happening in the 60s and music. So I didn't know the Rolling Stones all that much, but obviously the Beatles. But by the time I started teaching in school, it was the era of Simon and Garfunkel.
Hmm.
And then The Graduate came out, etc., etc. So that documentary, In Restless Dreams, that came out this year, and I see is actually streaming on Foxtel docos, so it's more available. And even though it was so long, uh, I was fascinated. I wanted to stay with the whole film right throughout, enjoying the music, the songs, and the memories and where it came, the role of Art Garfunkel, the differences between them, Paul Simon then and his African connections. I found it quite exhilarating as an overview of his life and career, and especially since he was doing it, in his early 80s, and the fact that it was made by Alex Gibney, who mustn't sleep ever because he's forever making documentaries and they're
Yes.
getting longer. And the other day I read he's already planning one on the killer who killed the
Ah.
insurance man in New York.
Ah.
With him, he's always make a contract, so never sleeps. But over the decades, certainly documentaries that are well worth seeing.
Yes.
So in our remaining time, will I try out some of the English language films?
Go for it.
Well, a good one I thought was The Holdovers. I was very taken, and I can always be taken with Paul Giamatti.
Yeah.
But as a teacher who wasn't the sweetest teacher to meet, and the surly boy, and that whole relationship in the context of the school, but especially then I hadn't seen Darvine Randolph before. I hadn't noticed her. And then she gets an Oscar.
Mm.
But a very striking performance, which makes the film memorable in terms of a different school film.
Yep.
Um, Speaking of a different school film, film school, so to speak, that I did enjoy, small budget, was Ghostlight. I don't know what I was expecting, and there weren't too many of us in the cinema, so I couldn't really compare too many notes. But as it went on, and this story revealing itself of a family who had a tragedy, and the father blaming himself for the killing of his son, and the surly daughter and her reaction against them, and then the strange experience that he should actually get connected with a small theatre company putting on Romeo and Juliet. I
Mm.
mean, on paper, And as I say it, that might say, well, that's certainly improbable. And yet, I thought it was wonderful.
Yep.
The transformation for him, the appreciation of Shakespeare's language and the reenactment. And I was very taken with this Filipina actress who nabbed him when he was in depression doing some work and
Mm.
brought him in. And I thought, I wonder who she is. And then I found, was it The Triangle of Sadness? Was that the
Yes,
film she was in? I
exactly.
looked, oh, yeah, she was very, very striking in that. So it's a wonder she hasn't been in more films,
Yeah.
stealing her from the family at times. So I just thought I'd mention that if people hadn't seen Ghostlight, it's small, it's modest. Uh, I've seen the main actor recently in a television series, and I've just forgotten what it was. So he's well known, and the actress who is his wife is his real wife, and the
Yep.
daughter is his actual daughter. So it's
Yes.
a film. So that was Ghostlight,
Yes, and I must
and
say that the title was slightly misleading. I thought before I'd seen it that it was a horror film or something like that, and of course, Ghostlight refers to a light that's left on in a theater overnight or
yes.
whatever. Um, so don't be put off by the title. It is a very good film. I agree with you.
Now I've got a couple of eccentric ones before we finish
Sure.
that appeal to me and my sense of humour. Um, Greedy people.
I hadn't seen it. Yeah.
Greedy people, when you start to watch it and as it goes through, all you're thinking of is the film Fargo.
Ah.
It, it's in that vein. And, the things that happen and the characters and their interactions are quite strange, ludicrous in many ways, but I found tickled my sense of humour a great deal. And I really liked it. Now, not a great film, but it's one of those pleasures. Oh, I wasn't expecting this,
Hmm.
and I've really enjoyed it. So,
Okay.
and another one like that, which I enjoyed, was Wicked Little Letters
Uh-huh.
with Olivia Colman. And again, that tickled my fancy, allegedly based on true stories, and especially the mystery of who wrote these poison pen letters. And the way that the solution was revealed, and well, it has Olivia Colman in it, so it couldn't be. And what's the name? The Irish actress whose name eludes me for the minute.
Um. Not Saoirse Ronan.
No, the other one.
The other one.
She's in
Uh,
everything.
yeah, doesn't matter.
But the best thing was Timothy Spall
Ah,
as Olivia Colman's father,
right.
and just interactions between father and daughter, and the climax and the revelation of the letters should have been terribly serious. And I found I was laughing out loud. It was so well done. So they were two that really tickled my fancy.
Okay.
So one that I liked and got mixed reviews, but I liked the work of M. Night Shyamalan
Uh-huh.
over the years, up and down perhaps, but I really enjoyed Trap
Yep.
with Josh Hartnell. And I thought it was written even more cleverly than some of his others. And so I enjoyed it. And, the lovely father and child at the concert and how nice it was. And then the gradual revelation and revelation and getting worse and worse in terms of villains and crime, etc. So, again, I was very taken with that.
Yes.
Before I end, I will mention I found the substance intriguing.
Right.
Some people were horrified, and in a sense, I was horrified,
Yep.
but I thought the way that it was done
Hmm.
was certainly intriguing, and hats off to Demi Moore for playing that role.
Yes.
And Margaret Qualley is proving herself in all kinds of films.
Hmm.
Uh, and Dennis Quaid, good on him for being such a horrible macho type. And it was interesting, the science of the film, Frankensteinian kind of thing, but the critique of the male gaze, I really found very powerful.
Yep.
And so I think I didn't make a list of 10 best because I had 11 foreign language ones. But again, in making a list, I think I'd better find a place for the Joker and I'd better find a place for the substance as well.
Okay.
I've got one more nice one. Can I finish with that one,
Of
perhaps?
course, of course. And then I just want to ask you something, but yeah, keep going.
Inside Out 2.
Ah.
I had I had liked the first one, but hadn't remembered it and didn't realize it was 8 years ago. It's a
Hmm.
bit like Moana. Moana was 8 years ago, the first one. Time
Yep.
flying, so to speak.
Yes.
But I thought that somehow or other, the way they got the characters and the voices and the themes, especially the 13-year-old, I thought was highly entertaining. And I would guess the teachers would welcome it.
Hmm.
And for the 12, 13, 14-year-olds, showing that in school, especially to the girls, that they would get a lot of comment, a lot of dialogue, a lot of insight. So I thought I'll finish positively. I really enjoyed Inside Out too.
Yes, I agree with you with that. With that, it's a lovely way of dealing with emotions and very appropriate for a teen age group. I just wanted to ask you, Peter. You mentioned no Australian films sort of met your fancy. What about Memoir of a Snail?
I did like it, yes. Um, in its grim kind of way, I found it fascinating. In terms of the Australian films this year, certainly that's up there. My colleague liked Force of Nature very much.
Right.
I enjoyed it, but since I have read The Dry, Exiles, and another one, and I find Jane Harper, I could read her very well.
Yep.
But I was very much taken with some of the smaller budget ones.
Uh-huh.
And one of our themes is we're often on the lookout for Indigenous characters and Indigenous themes.
Yes.
And so I found five that I would like to nominate in our report. Uh, say Kid Snow.
Ah, yeah.
So there was Mark Cole Smith. So in 1971, there are the Aborigines in the boxing tours, etc.
Yep.
Then on the other hand, there's the Mugai,
Ah, yeah.
which as a horror film was interesting, but it was making that comparison with the Mugai stealing the Aboriginal children's souls with the Australian government and the stolen children.
Yep.
So I found it interestingly symbolic. And just recently, I watched Under Streetlights.
Ah,
It's a nice film.
yes.
Uh, it's Samson and Delilah in a very nice
Yes.
mode.
Yeah.
Alice Springs. But I thought for the young audience who likes music and these teenagers and their singing and their composing, but the background of their fathers and alcoholism and racism, I thought it's a film, again, that you'd like to show, say, to a younger group.
Hmm.
So it's not kind of in your face threatening,
Yep.
but it's real enough and it's nice enough to be able to work with it.
Yes.
And another one that I had, of course, was Runt and Deborah Mailman and her role as coaching the girl, the dog, etc.
Yes. Yes.
So, um, in many ways, there have been quite a number of smaller budgets in the Australian films, which I think is a very good collection. But of course, it's not spectacular like some of the others.
Hmm.
So that'd be my response to the Australian films this year. Lots of horror ones as well.
Yes. No, it's
We-
quite
we-
an eclectic list as always from you, Peter.
Well, it is. And so I thought I'd be very virtuous. And I didn't mention some of the films that really I didn't like The Fabulous. Oh, I've just mentioned The Fabulous Four, which didn't appeal to me at all, despite Susan Sarandon.
Yes.
Too silly for me. So there are a number like that, but they'll go
Sure.
unnamed.
Fair enough. Fair enough. No, I appreciate that. And as I say, you have such an interesting eclectic list as always. And I'm sure I'll be seeing you soon at a screening or two because there's a lot of good films coming up by the looks of it.
They got us in early with Nosferatu, which is very good,
Yes.
but
Yes.
That has to go on hold for another 12 months.
It does. As do films like Honora and Amelia Perez, which are amazing. But anyway, that's another story, and they are for next year. I agree with you. Peter Malone, always great to talk to you. Peter Malone from the Catholic Film Office with his list of best films of the year and some other films. As always, good to talk to you and all the best.
Thank you, Peter. I enjoyed the conversation as always.
Okay. See you later. Bye bye.
Bye.